We want to show appreciation to President Trump for recognizing the discrimination that Afrikaners are experiencing through racial legislation. They say we own the most land in the country, which is false.
For decades, land ownership in South Africa was anything but fair. During colonial rule and apartheid, laws were created to keep land in the hands of the white minority while pushing the black majority into poor, overcrowded areas. One of the most infamous of these laws was the 1913 Natives Land Act, which made it nearly impossible for black South Africans to own land. This pattern of land dispossession continued for decades, leading to forced removals and deep economic inequality.
We've seen in Zimbabwe, it did not bring prosperity that everybody in Zimbabwe now have land. We've seen hyperinflation, we've seen millions of people leaving Zimbabwe, we have seen the economic collapse, and we are seeing people that are unemployed at the moment in Zimbabwe.
But is the story really that simple? Zimbabwe's land issues go all the way back to British colonial rule. Under the 1930 Land Apportionment Act, black Africans were stripped of their right to own land freely. This law forced millions of indigenous Zimbabweans onto poor, overcrowded reserves, while a tiny white settler population controlled more than half of the country's most fertile farmland. Back in 1979, during the Lancaster House peace talks, where Zimbabwe's future was being decided, Britain made a promise. As part of the agreement that led to the country's independence, the British government pledged to help fund a land redistribution programme. At the time, land ownership in Zimbabwe was completely lopsided. A tiny group of white settlers, descended from British colonial rulers, controlled most of the country's best farmland. Meanwhile, the vast majority of black Zimbabweans had been pushed onto poor, overcrowded lands. Fixing this injustice was supposed to be a key part of independence. Britain initially followed through, sort of. It provided £44 million in aid for land reform in the early years after independence. But that amount was nowhere near enough to address the deep inequalities in land ownership. And when Zimbabwe kept pressing Britain to honour its full commitment, something unexpected happened. In 1997, Claire Short, Britain's International Development Secretary at the time, delivered a stunning blow. She told Zimbabwe's leaders that because her government had no ties to the country's colonial past, Britain no longer had any special responsibility to help with land reform. Just like that, the UK walked away from its promise. But the problem wasn't just that Britain refused to help. Zimbabwe's land reform programme had been rigged from the start. Under the terms of the Lancaster House Agreement, land would not be returned to its original owners. Instead, Zimbabwe's new government was forced into a willing buyer, willing seller system. That meant the Zimbabwean government had to buy back the land, in British pounds or US dollars. The price was set by the white landowners who had taken the land in the first place. 95% of Zimbabwe's economy was controlled by Europeans and Americans, making it nearly impossible for black Zimbabweans to reclaim land on their own. This system was slow, expensive, and frustrating. Year after year, Zimbabwe struggled to make progress. Meanwhile, the people who had fought for independence, the war veterans who had risked their lives to free their country, were still landless. Eventually, they had had enough. By the late 1990s, Zimbabweans were fed up with waiting. Frustrated war veterans and landless citizens began taking matters into their own hands, occupying white-owned farms across the country. Faced with growing pressure, the government finally gave in to the will of the people. In June 2000, Zimbabwe officially seized white-owned farms and redistributed the land. But this move set off a chain reaction that would reshape the country's future. Britain's response was swift. It condemned Zimbabwe's actions. And then came the real punishment. The United States and the European Union stepped in, imposing some of the harshest sanctions Zimbabwe had ever seen. In 2002, the European Union froze assets and banned key Zimbabwean officials from travelling. In 2003, US President George W. Bush issued an executive order that officially declared Zimbabwe a threat to American interests. That declaration pushed Zimbabwe into economic isolation. Under these sanctions, Zimbabwe was cut off from international banks like the IMF and World Bank. Foreign companies were banned from doing business with the Zimbabwean government. The country was forced to repay all its international debt, immediately and in full. Western leaders called these targeted measures meant to pressure Zimbabwe's government, but in reality, the sanctions crippled the entire economy, hurting ordinary people more than politicians. While many blame Zimbabwe's economic collapse on the land seizures, they often overlook the devastating impact of these severe economic restrictions. Imagine waking up one day and finding out that your entire country has been cut off from the rest of the world. No money can come in, no businesses can trade internationally, and even basic necessities like medicine and fertilizers become nearly impossible to get. That's exactly what happened to Zimbabwe. The Industrial Development Corporation of Zimbabwe, IDCZ, the state-run organization responsible for driving industrial growth, was completely blacklisted. Every cent it had in foreign accounts, frozen. But that was just the beginning. The United States went even further, ensuring that no foreign banks could conduct business with Zimbabwe. As a result, the country was completely isolated from global markets, unable to access credit, trade essential goods, or even import the technology it needed to keep industries running. The impact was devastating. The domino effect of economic sanctions. With no access to funding or global trade, entire industries in Zimbabwe started crumbling. Agriculture suffered. Farmers couldn't get fertilizers or modern equipment. Factories shut down. They couldn't import spare parts to keep machines running. Hospitals ran short on medicine because Zimbabwe was locked out of the international supply chain. And then came the drought, a natural disaster that only made things worse. With agricultural productivity already struggling due to sanctions, food shortages became even more severe. People were starving, and yet the Western media refused to acknowledge the real cause. Instead, the popular narrative became, that's the story the world was told. But is it the truth? By the late 2000s, Zimbabwe's currency was in freefall. The value of the Zimbabwean dollar crashed so hard that the government started printing trillion-dollar notes, money so worthless that people needed wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy bread. The official explanation? Mugabe's mismanagement. But let's look at the facts. When a country is cut off from international banking, trade and credit, what options does it have left? The government had no choice but to print more money in a desperate attempt to keep the economy afloat. And when more money is printed without actual wealth to back it up, inflation skyrockets. The economic collapse wasn't just about land reform, it was a direct result of the crushing sanctions imposed by Western powers. Today, Zimbabwe is still paying the price. The government is negotiating with the US, hoping to get the sanctions lifted. But Washington has made one thing very clear. Before sanctions are removed, Zimbabwe must compensate white farmers for the land that was taken from them. But how is Zimbabwe supposed to pay when the economy is already struggling under the weight of these sanctions? This isn't just about Zimbabwe. It's about a larger pattern, a world where African nations are constantly lectured and punished whenever they make decisions that don't align with Western interests. Yet, something is changing. President Traoré has made a bold move, showing that African leaders can stand their ground and put their country's interests first.